I work in the Western Maryland room. This is sadly our last lecture of the season. We'll be back in either September or October, I'm not sure which, but we will be back. You will all be back too, I'm sure. I don't have a list of what's happening next season, as I call it, although it's still this year, so you'll just have to look for your newsletter, find out. Well, tonight we have the Treasure Train Storytellers, that's hard to say. Treasure Train Storytellers for the evening. We have Rebecca Rush and RJ Rush. They're going to take turns. It'll be so exciting. Their specialties, as you may have noticed from what's displayed in the back, are how the Civil War changed our money and how money changed the war, among other specialties. Most of all, I would like to just explain how that name, No Small Change, well, I'm not sure how it came about, but now I know why. Because what happened during and after the Civil War, all of the ways that what we take for granted now changed were very big ways. There might have been small ways, but a lot of them were very big ways. So no small change is just that. Different presentations that No Small Change has given include at numismatic clubs, that's also hard to say, Civil War roundtables, and historic societies. This Furious Flight of the Confederate Train presentation has been adapted from their book, which is undergoing revisions, and I hope that they'll tell us more about that. Their other books and presentations are produced under the banner of Money, Mayhem, and Might Sagas. All right, that's enough from me. Who's speaking first? Rebecca's first.
Thank you all. I really appreciate your being here. And just to let you know, the organization is actually a 501c3 nonprofit. And so we do educational programs, we do research, we do what we call storytelling. I would not think of us as scholars. We try to be much more buoyant than being scholars. But I'd like to take you today on this trip of the Confederate treasure train. I don't know whether anybody has ever heard of these sagas where the money had to leave Richmond, Virginia. Rick is the expert, and he'll tell you much more in a minute. But I think it's very important to know that during the same period of time, in 1865, was when this event happened. And by same period of time, I mean from April 2nd to May 10th. So we are right now at the 159th anniversary of this significant event.
Television, ain't it great? Technology is even better.
I hear it, yeah. I don't understand it all, but.
All right, here we go. Yeah. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy that you're here. We've done a lot of research, and I'm going to use the clicker. Sometimes I just start talking and I don't even advance everything. The two books that we've already written on this particular topic required a lot of research. There's a lot more that took place than you could imagine in the Deep South when the Confederacy collapsed. You'll learn a lot more about it. But, Becky and I took two trips last year and the year before. We called it our Dixie Dive, and we went down through South Carolina, Georgia, into Florida, the areas where the train made it, or remnants of the train, which we'll describe for you. And some of it deals with money, some of it with, shall we say, double dealing, some of it with, shall we say, outright mutiny. People wanted that money, and I'll explain how desperate people got to be toward the end of the trip, which ended in Washington, Georgia on May 10th. So we'll start off with a bang. Anyway, this is Richmond, Virginia. It fell to Ulysses S. Grant on April the 2nd. Lee's lines were all broken, and the city, it was a very desperate time. You can see people leaving the city. They evacuated it, Chicago, where they could, across the James River. After a certain point, they burned all the bridges so that the northern troops couldn't come up from Petersburg. Now, if you were wealthy or very well connected politically, you had another option besides your feet and your horse. Come on, baby. Oh, come on. Oh, no, I pushed the wrong button. Becky, you know how to make it go back to its other form? There we go. Anyway, the bottom line is, on the 2nd, there was still money left in the Treasury. How much we'll explore a little bit. Very controversial as to how much was ever in the Treasury at the end. Okay, cool, great, good. And when the trains were lined up on the Danville line, they started to burn everything in the archives that they could, so that the North couldn't get their hands on state secrets. I know they still carried a great deal of paper money, notes, and bonds with them on the trains, but they didn't destroy those until they got to Georgia. There's a lot of controversy, for what it's worth, as to how many trains were actually departed on the April 2nd and 3rd. But one quote that I found said that the banks will move tonight. 8 trains are provided for transportation. No provisions are made for civilian employees and their families. So in other words, if you weren't politically connected, it's too bad. The money got out of town, Jeff Davis got out of town, his cabinet got out of town. I also say there were only 2 trains, the presidential train and the treasure train. But in our digging around, we found evidence that there were at least 1 decoy train that was absolutely empty. So if you think about it, if you had the entire Union Army after you, and you had only 1 train with all of your money and all the Richmond Bank money, which we'll get to, I don't think you'd want them to be able to capture 1 train. Your game would be over. So they probably sent 2 or 3 trains out and had absolutely nothing in them. So people would be confused when they tried to capture them or go after them. And this is, of course, the code for trouble ahead, trouble behind from Casey Jones. But we're going to explore now exactly what might have been on the train and why. Okay. By the way, the picture here is a good representation of the way the trains looked, because people, knowing that they had no other choice, just literally jumped on the trains. And just as depicted here, on the cow catcher, any way that they could grab a hold of something and get out of Richmond, they did. They also had paper money, bars of gold, which came from the banks, were all hastily loaded on, because they realized that if they didn't take the money, either A, the North would confiscate it, which they could do by law, and or other Southerners would simply take it because they wouldn't want the North to get it. So why shouldn't the South take it? That was the logic that went through the whole last few days of the Confederacy. Oh man, my clumsy, there we go. So what was officially in the Treasury? Well, let's see. When you look at the official records, the math doesn't add up at the end. I'll show you that too. $85,000 in gold coin and bullion, $35,000 in silver bullion, up to possibly $10 million of what they called slugs, or remnants of coins and sweepings from the floors of 3 Confederate mints. That's New Orleans and Charlotte and Dahlonega. 36 or 38,000, depending on what you read. In Mexican silver reals, they had lots of reals because they could still sell cotton to Mexico. They didn't have to worry about the embargoes and the ships that could not get out to England and France. So they had a lot of silver money, but it was all in Mexican reals, not in US silver dollars. And curiously enough, tons of copper coins, and that's all it was identified as. Now, the real money, the big money, was really from the Richmond banks, the depository banks in Richmond. $450,000 in gold and coin was loaded onto the train. Now, keep in mind that you have to multiply that number by about 25 to 30 times for an equivalency today. So that's about $7 or $8 million in gold. And the reason that banks wanted to load it on in a big hurry, it was all signed off to the commissary department, which is part of the War Department, not the Treasury. It was signed off because it was trying to get, the objective was to get that money to Robert E. Lee before his army was defeated. He desperately needed the money. The state of Virginia, believe it or not, guaranteed the money to the banks. And the state of Virginia was guaranteed the money by the CSA with cotton. And of course, at the very end, everything collapsed. So nobody got any cotton, nobody got their money back, basically. And the banks all failed by, the end of the war. But that's another 10 years out after the war. Now, the part that I found most interesting in the U.S. War Court, which convened after the Civil War was over, there was, through the U.S. House of Representatives, a big hoopla to figure out where the money came from, where the money went. And the part that I found most fascinating was there were tons and tons of boxes and crates that were loaded onto the train that were private property. So it's sort of like you and I having a safe deposit box. But everyone had these large crates, and when they interviewed the bankers, this one was Farmers Bank, they would have things like, hand trunk to whom it belonged or what it was. I never knew, said the banker. Labeled FB in Charlottesville, Virginia, 2 boxes. I cannot state what they contained. And it went on and on and on that way. The 23rd and 24th items on said invoice were packages of bank branch notes, blah, blah, blah. And they were destroyed or burned at Abbeville, South Carolina, which we'll get into. And so-and-so had custody of them on the bank, for the bank, on the train. This was all testimony given in May of 1866. The thing I've always wondered about is to what extent was money from the Knights of the Golden Circle? Is anybody familiar with that organization at all? Yeah? Okay. Very wealthy individuals, all in the suburbs, a kind of organization in the South, organized mostly in New Orleans. And their whole purpose, if you ever heard the phrase, the South shall rise again, well, they were the ones that wanted to put up the money in order for the South to rise again. They had the money. And some of it, about $80,000 in gold, was given to a guy named George Trenholm, which we'll talk about. And he did take it to Liverpool, where he had a bank, an exchange bank. And the idea, was that someday, when the South needed it, we'd have that money. So some of this money was indeed sent overseas. Some of it eventually was confiscated by the U.S. government, but we'll get into all that. But that's the area that I found to be the most fascinating. There were pages of documentation from the U.S. War Court describing box after box after box that just had somebody's name on it. Pick a name, Rebecca Rush, 3 boxes, contents unknown. And it went on and on and on. They just threw that stuff on to the train as fast as they could and get it out of town. Now this is a wonderful little depiction of where the train went. It came from another book which I found to be really great. It's called Flight into Oblivion, and it was written in 1938, the same basic year that Gone with the Wind came out. And I think it would make a tremendous movie. The guy who wrote it thought it would be a great movie because the adventures that these people got into to escape the North and to avoid capture and to hide money, oh man, it rivaled Gone with the Wind any day of the week. But Gone with the Wind dominated the press and everybody's imagination in 1938. This little story also slipped into oblivion, but we're going to try to revive it a little bit. And the thing that you might find interesting is if you look really carefully, you'll see in some parts there's a train, and in some places there's a wagon train, and it goes back to being a steam train and back to a wagon train. And that in reality is what happened to these guys because General Stoneman and General Sherman tore a railroad track in the South, and the trains would have to stop, put everything onto a wagon train any which way they could muster wagons, ambulances, farm carts, take it to the next town where there was rail lines, load it up, and keep going south. Now, they made it to Danville, which was the de facto capital for the South from April 3rd until April 10th. And I don't know if you guys, I don't know if you're as old as me, but in 1969, the band put out a song called The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. And it was all about that particular period of time. So if you know your stuff, you'll see that he served on the Danville train until Stoneman's cavalry came and tore up the tracks again. And that is exactly what happened in Danville during that period of time. Now, in terms of money, there were 40 barrels like that, the old whiskey barrels, filled with those silver coins. Allegedly, they went to the Bank of Danville to exchange for paper money. So if you guys had some paper money, which was becoming worthless by the day, they would allow you to exchange one silver dollar for $70 of paper money. You could bring in $70, you could walk out with one silver dollar. That was the rate of exchange. But then there was a big debate whether or not that money ever got to where it was intended, because only 10 barrels were rolled back onto the train. And there was a big rumor, which persists to this day, that the rest of the money was actually buried in a plot where somebody named Lieutenant Robert Jones of the 18th Virginia Infantry is buried. It's a big enough plot for 10 men. There's only one person buried there. Everyone thinks the money was buried there in order to try to save it to get it to Robert E. Lee. Lee, of course, was defeated on April the 9th. He never came for the money. He never got the bank money. And so my point is that people have requested of that cemetery to metal detect, to go in there with ground penetrating radar. They've been declined for the last 100 years. It's kind of an unusual story, but it's absolutely true. No one knows what's really buried there.
Yeah.
Now, the trailer train was always a few miles ahead of the presidential train. The presidential train stayed in Danville until the 10th, when they learned that Lee had surrendered. They knew they were going to be in hot water. However, by April 7th, the money had made it down as far as Greensboro, North Carolina. And General Joe Johnston, who was head of the Army of Tennessee, he met with Confederate bursar, his name was John Wildes, and he took $37,000 or maybe $39,000 in the silver, I'll call them silver dollars. What's the name of the paper? Reals. I keep saying pesos. Anyway, there's where some of the money went. That went for his payroll. And in just a few more days, Johnston would be negotiating with General William Sherman to surrender his army, which was far bigger than Lee's army. So when Johnston finally does surrender, it's like 90,000 men that were under his command, all the way from South Carolina down to Virginia. So when that happens, we'll get to it. That treasure train was on its own. So by April 8th, they make it down to Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte was a tiny town at the time, only 5,000 people, $800,000 today. I still think they must have left most of the money at that branch bank to have that town take off like that. But anyway, the mint, which was one of the U.S. mints in the South, minted only gold coins up until 1861, was still like a vault. And so they unloaded all the money for a few days into the Charlotte Mint and kept it under heavy guard. Let's see, we'll just go right ahead here. Here we go. So the first big defining moment for this group of men and women on the train was on April 9th, when General Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant. And they realize that they're in deep trouble. So that's when the presidential train leaves on April the 10th, knowing that there was no one there to protect them any longer. And they still had the $450,000 in gold from the Richmond banks on board. They got down to Chesterville, South Carolina. I don't know, this was on April 13th, they made that far. I don't know if any of you know Mary Chestnut, the authoress. Okay, she's a friend of Verena Davis, put her up for a while, that's President Davis's wife. And they were staying in Chesterville, and she actually saw a train pull up, and they took everything off the train, and every box was empty, which leads me to think they had at least one decoy train. She wrote in her journal, I was aghast because the train was empty. And on the left, when we took our little trip down to Savannah, this was a little Sherman's necktie that was, of course, on display down at the Railroad Museum in Savannah. And this is a great example of what Sherman did when he destroyed the rail lines in the South. You know, he heated them up and they twisted them while they were molten, and no one could restore the lines again. So that's where the term Sherman's necktie comes from. That happened in Chesterville. They could not go any further because the lines were destroyed. And this is a good depiction of, you know, there's a train, there's a whole batch of wagons. They had to load everything off the train, and they had to put it onto wagons, ambulances, anything they could get their hands on to get it to Newberry, South Carolina. Newberry at the time was a huge depot center for the Confederacy. I don't know if you guys knew it, but that's where they relied on a lot of supplies coming and going all the time for the Southern Army. And I came across a book written by a quartermaster named Robert Patrick, also known as the Reluctant Rebel. Anyway, he was there and he saw what he called the Richmond Bank train, not the Confederate Treasury train, come into town. And it was filled with bullion, and he passed through this place last week. That would have been April 14th. He wrote the letter around April 20th. And he said this was the coin contained in the banks of Richmond. So that confirms that. He saw a train that had nothing to do with the Treasury. It was Richmond Bank gold. Then the next huge calamity for the South and anyone trying to get away. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on the 15th, which is about the same time they were in South Carolina. And the word traveled very quickly by horseback, as you can imagine. And by the time the people on the treasure train learned about this, they realized that they were in very hot water, and they doubled down on getting even further south. But the Union stepped up its cavalry pursuit. This picture also comes from Flight into Oblivion. It's a great little illustration. They then made it into a little tiny town called 96. I don't know if you guys ever heard of it. We were there. It's not a big town. It's a railroad stop, and it's in South Carolina, and it had an old Revolutionary fort there, which is now a national park. And there was some discussion apparently that they should leave some of the treasure at that fort. I can't find any real evidence that they did, but there's more evidence they left some at Fort Charlotte. Okay, Abbeville, South Carolina. I don't know if you guys know much about it, but it was known for a long time as the birthplace and the deathbed of the Confederacy. And we spent some time there. Abbeville is kind of a complicated story to keep up with all the places they went and the timing. They made it to Abbeville. They sent everything by wagon train again down towards Georgia. But then they made it back, which I'll explain later, back into Abbeville on May the 2nd to meet with President Davis for the last time with the War Council. That's when his general said there's just no point in going any further. We have to throw in the towel. At that point, General Basil Duke of Kentucky took command of the train. This is an interesting part of our story. This gentleman, his name is Robert. I think he believes he's the reincarnation of Jeff Davis. He certainly looks like him. He's 82 years of age. He tells stories galore as if he lived them himself. And there's a picture of an elderly Jeff Davis. And anyway, this is on Secession Hill. This is where the South began the Civil War. And so he likes to hold court there and tell stories all day long. Anybody that'll listen. So we got a full earful of the Southern perspective of the war. He was a gentle soul, I have to admit. I mean, he was not screaming and yelling and making a big scene, but we learned a lot about things like the animosity between Joe Johnston and Jeff Davis was apparently because of a love triangle that both men were in love with the same woman. That's quite possible, but we picked up a lot of stories like that. And that, whoops, that poor little decrepit building there is the train station in Abbeville. Long out of commission, but that's where the train would have pulled in. It's just in the south part of Secession Hill. And they would have unloaded the train. This is also from the book, Flight into Oblivion. What's important here is that we're checking the manifest to see what was on board. The young man to the right with his horse, there were 160 men, young men, 16, 17, 18 years of age, who were brought in from Richmond from a naval command to guard the train. They were just boys. And that's very well depicted. They had to go through, well, what the hell's on the train? And what was it that, I'm sure people were able to pilfer things left and right because there really was no big authority watching over all this money as it changed from wagons to train. This is a great picture I found actually about the Army of the Tennessee. This is my interpretation of what it would look like when we try to get a wagon train across the Savannah River. There was no rail line. There was no bridge. There had only been a little ferry there called Hester's Ferry that could carry a horse and a wagon, and that was about it. So the Confederacy built a pontoon bridge from a place called Vienna, South Carolina, to Petersburg, Georgia. And I don't know if you guys have ever studied what it's like to take heavy objects across a pontoon bridge, but gold weighs, it had several tons of gold, they had several tons of useless paper money, and they kept moving this stuff. And at some point, you just cannot keep moving it without this kind of vibration, and sometimes the wagons would fall into a river, and that was the end of the line. So there's a rumor that a lot of gold was left just downstream on the South Carolina side at a Revolutionary War fort called Fort Charlotte. But in terms of anybody here who may want to be a treasure hunter, there's a problem which we'll get into. In the 1950s, the TVA said, well, there have been a lot of floods here that affect Augusta, and we need electricity. So we're going to dam the Savannah River just about at the place where Vienna and Lisbon and Petersburg came together. There's Abbeville way up there. They would have come down here, across the river, into Lisbon, into Lincoln County. Now the problem is that when they built the dam and they commissioned the dam, 78,000 acres of South Carolina and Georgia went underwater. And guess what? That included Vienna, Petersburg, and Lisbon, which are now under 40 feet of water, as is Fort Charlotte. We went down and took a peek. That's the Elijah Clark Park on the Georgia side, looking over to South Carolina. And this is the dam with the Savannah backed up here and the lower part of the Savannah down here. But there's if they did leave money at Fort Charlotte, or if they left money in Lisbon, which people rumored for a long time, it's now under 40 feet of water, owned by the federal government because it's under the authority of the TVA. Now, here's a very sophisticated map I put together last night. But I had to do it this way because this really gets confusing. They cross the pontoon bridge, they go into Washington. We'll tell the whole story here. They get down to a little town called Union Point, which used to be a fine little town. It's now basically abandoned. Between Augusta and Atlanta, it was an extremely important railroad. Took weapons and armaments from the armory in Augusta over to Atlanta to be then sent to other points for the Confederacy. Now, they got as far as the Union Point. They tried to make it down to Macon, Georgia, which was now, the road is now State Road 44. they learned that Macon had been just taken over by the Union troops, which Becky will tell you about. That happened on April 20th. They double back, they get stuck in the mud, they make it back, they get onto a train, they go to Augusta. We even traveled down to the little town of Waynesboro, Georgia, south of Augusta, and we interviewed people who said that their grandparents told them that there was a wagon train that they had tried to make it from Waynesboro to Savannah. But Savannah had been taken over by that time by William T. Sherman. So they doubled back from Augusta, back to Union Point, went back to Washington, and believe it or not, back to Abbeville, because the noose was really tight and they couldn't go anywhere in terms of Macon. They wanted to make it down to the Gulf of Mexico to get over to Texas, where they thought they could resurrect the Confederacy. Couldn't do it. Tried to make it to the sea, couldn't do it. So they go back to Abbeville. This is one little sidebar. I don't know if you guys are into railroad history, but the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company was extremely helpful to the South. And I'll explain myself. When Joe Johnston's army surrendered, the railroad offered every single soldier a free ride home as far as they could take it. They also, for the only year in their existence, they did not pay dividends to their shareholders, so they could afford to take care of the veterans. And they had issued all this script, this paper money, for the Confederate Treasury note, as you can see written on there. That was in February of 1863. That was absolutely worthless when the South collapsed. But the Georgia, the bank, it continued to accept money at face value. So you could walk in there with a totally worthless 25-cent note, and they'd give you a silver quarter for the next 5 or 10 years. It was remarkable. They became the biggest bank in the Southeast as a result of their activity. And Georgia is where this is down in Augusta. That building was built in 1967, and was eventually bought out by Wells Fargo. But that railroad had quite a big role to play for the South. Now, Washington, Georgia, this is an important part of the tale, and it might actually be enjoyable for you guys. On the left, in this middle town, this is the town where the treasure train finally gave up the ghost. This was the Bank of Georgia in the 1800s. They tore it down in 1902. They built this newer town hall, which is, of course, there to this day. And there's a sign that describes this fella, whom I've read a lot about, Micaiah H. Clark. And at the very end of the war, when they were in Washington, he was appointed to be the acting treasurer for the Confederate States of America for about 4 days. And there are a lot of documents in his name. Jeff Davis, when he appointed him as the acting treasurer, that was the last official document that Davis signed before the war was over. But we'll see the name Micaiah Clark a couple times here. And this is another great story. Down in the library in Washington, there's a hell of a story about this enormous chest. I mean, this is an ironclad thing. I'll tell you the story really fast. They found this treasure chest in the basement of that old bank that I showed you. And that was when they tore it down in 1902. The person who had owned that building gave it to the town, gave it to the town's library. And then in the 1920s, an 80-year-old Confederate vet walks into the library and says, "My God, when I was a 20-year-old kid, I guarded that chest. I guarded 2 others just like it." And that's a hell of a story. And so they decided in 1948 to hire somebody out of Atlanta to open this thing. And with great fanfare, they did. They found absolutely nothing in there except for one Jefferson nickel from 1938 that a child was slipped in there somehow. But it was indeed part of the treasure train. And to have an 80-year-old vet show up and say, "When I was a kid, I guarded that thing." That is really cool. So it was really astonishing. Now, one more part of the story. You guys know anything about Robert Toombs? He was a real fighter here from down in the South. He He lived right down the street from that library, right down the street from City Hall. I mean, Becky and I walked down to his house, it's no big deal. He was a very influential guy, and he refused to surrender. He did not want to sign the loyalty oath. So it's interesting because, according to everything I've read, some other Confederates threw $5,000 in cash onto his yard and said, "Robert, get the hell out of the country because they're going to arrest you and then you're going to be in jail for the rest of your life." What he did instead, he was a really very well-connected guy and a very clever guy. He paid a visit to the Union General Lot Abraham, who at that point had taken over the Washington County, Washington area after the South surrendered. And he was very well respected by the way later in life, and people wrote about him. Said he was always treating people extremely fairly. Anyway, Lot receives this entreaty from Toombs. He said, "I've got $5,000 in hard cold cash. I'd like to give it to the Union. You guys can confiscate it. However, I ask only one thing, and that's my freedom." So somebody from even higher up the food chain told Lot, "Okay, go over to his place, have a cigar with the man, sit down for a bottle of scotch," which they did. And $5,000 in hard cold cash was put on the table. Two lieutenants of Lot Abraham counted out the money, which was $5,140 some odd dollars. They slid the money across the table, and Robert Toombs never had to sign that loyalty oath. So we decided, hey, let's go down and take a look at this place. So we did. And there's Becky actually visiting Robert Toombs. Isn't that remarkable? Great, just for us. And there's a beautiful painting that some local artists did of the home, much more attractive as a painting than the real thing. And there's the loyalty oath, which he refused to sign. And in 1867, he remained an unreconstructed rebel for the rest of his life. And he can thank that $5,000 from the Confederate treasure train and some good negotiating skills, a good cigar, and some whiskey that he gained his freedom. A lot of people aren't that lucky, they don't have that extra $5,000 to sit around. So let's see, 5 times under 25, that would have been about $125,000 today, give or take. Then we went down to this sad little town called Union Point, which used to be pretty influential. That's the place that's halfway between Atlanta and Augusta on the Georgia Railroad line. There's the railroad tracks. And that poor abandoned bank building has a sign in front of it. And it says, commemorating the Confederate Wayside Home, 1862, 1864, whose activities were carried on by 14 women of Union Point. And that was under the Work Program Administration, WPA, of Roosevelt in 1936. Then I have one more little surprise, and that is I read about this thing called Buffalo Lick. I said, what the hell is that? And people mentioned in the memos, it's right outside of town. And there's a sign, and there's a road sign, and I can't believe it, but in the 1700s, there were actually buffalo in that part of Georgia, along with Indian tribes, of course. But buffalo going down to lick the ground someplace, I had a hard time believing it. So this one proved to you guys that there's really a buffalo lick Georgia. Had to do it. Okay, as we briefly described before, the wagon train tries to get towards Macon, Georgia from Union Point. And they can't because they've learned that it surrendered to General Wilson April 20th. Wagons circle back, they get stuck in the mud at Daniel Springs, Public Square, Georgia. There are tales of gold being dumped near the banks of the Oconee River in Greensboro, Georgia. And then the Oconee River itself was dammed, just like the Savannah in 1979. Again, washing away or submerging a lot of historic sites. A wagon train returns to Washington, Georgia, catches a steam train towards Augusta. Meanwhile, now we're talking about April 25th or so, somewhere in that neighborhood, there's some big things going on up in Durham, North Carolina. William Sherman accepts the surrender of Joe Johnston, as we discussed, April 26, 1865. And that was in a little place that looked just like this. the Bennett place, which we visited, yes, we did. And they rebuilt the home to look the way the homestead looked when the two men sat down. And as you can see, when Johnston surrendered, it was 17 days after Appomattox, and that ended the war in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. So that poor little treasure train with all that money on board had no protection. Everyone wanted the money. The North wanted to confiscate it. The South said, if we don't take, the soldiers basically said, if we don't take it, the North is going to take it, which leads us to a whole other part of the story. May 1st, this is kind of cool. This is from the coin company Saturday. This is one of those Mexican reals we talked about. So on May 1st, you can see the date, May the 1st, 1865, from General Joseph E. Johnston. He doled out 39,000 of those things. I don't know if they all had his personal little stamp on it like that. I have no idea how many did. But May 1st is when the last payroll for Joe Johnston was meted out. Okay, let's see what's important here. Confederate paper money is now totally valueless. It becomes ballast and dump it like it was straw. Treasure train is boxed in. They can't go to Macon. They can't go to Savannah. They flee back to Abbeville for a final meeting with the Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his war council. That's May 2nd. And as I said before, General Basil Duke of Kentucky, who I find to be an interesting guy, takes over the protection of the treasure train. There's just a little bit about Basil Duke. 100 years after his service in the war, he becomes the de facto spokesman for Old Crow whiskey, which I kind of find interesting. And I read about him, and it said that when he was captured, and he very peacefully surrendered, he talked up a storm with his captors. They actually got along with him, so they decided to depict the guy in full Confederate regalia in New York City, which would be like a death wish at that time, happily talking to his northern friends and drinking a good shot of whiskey. I kind of appreciate that myself. He was also married to Morgan's sister, so he was an influential guy. Did a lot of kind of cool things after the war. But anyway, he's the guy who took control of the train for the last few miles. Now, things really have gotten out of hand for the South. I mean, there's no protection left to speak of. May 2nd, President Johnson offers $100,000 in gold for the capture of Jeff Davis. That's a lot of money. I mean, that's $2.5 million today. At the time, the Union cavalry did not know that there was such a reward, and Becky will get into that. But anyway, May 2nd, the offer goes up for $100,000. May 2nd, the last meeting of the Confederate cabinet in Abbeville. May 10th, the treasure train meets the end of the line in Washington, Georgia, but we have a lot more to tell you, so hang on to your hats. We did a little write-up of where the money went, which I thought you might want to know, especially if we could make out. All right, remember, these are all 1865 numbers, multiply them by at least 25 for today's equivalency. So $39,000, General Johnston's final payroll, May 1st. $100,000 to General Breckinridge and his cavalry. It was sort of a mutiny situation. A lot of men decided they did not want any paper money. They only wanted gold and silver, and they took it off the train by hook or by crook, but $100,000. $10,000 dispersed by McCauley Clark to the protective guard that took Davis further south. $40,000 was sent to Augusta, Georgia, to federal authorities for charity and hospital care of the CSA parolees. $25,000 in British gold sovereigns were dispersed by McCauley Clark near Gainesville, Florida, in mid-May when he learned that his liege, Jeff Davis, had been captured. He said, oh, okay, I got to disperse what's left in my little treasury. $80,000 in gold is dispersed to George Trenholm, Secretary of the Treasury, who was a very flamboyant guy. And by the way, he was later arrested right after the war with a sack of gold at a train station and jailed in a federal jail for 3 months. Still came out smelling like a rose. And it's thought that Margaret Miller based her character of Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind on George Trenthold, as you guys know. $5,000 went to Robert Toombs, as we discussed. And then several $100 million in CSA paper money and bonds were burned in Sandersville, Georgia, just a couple days before the treasure train surrendered in Washington, Georgia, at the direction of McCauley Clark, Lieutenant to objectives. So now we're going to start Act 2, the Richmond Gold, which is not the same as the Treasury. I'll tell you about an inside story about Vaughn's Raiders, which is a Southern outfit. They're the ones that allegedly stole the money. It's an inside job, and we'll go on and on here. We'll make it quick. All right, May 24th, the Lot Abraham allows the wagons to leave Washington, Georgia with $450,000 in bank gold with minimal guard. They make it 20 miles. They camp next to the Savannah River. It's a lovely night. Everyone's happy. Everyone's pleasant. Just a pleasant evening. And then they hear the sound of horses. And this line comes from a place they now call Gravel Road in Wilkes County, Georgia. A band of men pretending to be Union cavalry, but they were actually all Confederates. They raided the train. They took at least $200,000 in gold, including some of those beautiful big $50 slugs, as they were called out of California. And they made away with most of it. A lot of it dropped to the ground. And Basil Duke later said in his memoirs that for years to come, people will be looking around Wilkes County for the dropped gold. And they have been, believe me, they have been. And that little freshwater park state was just to show you roughly where in Georgia all this took place. Just to give you a point of reference. Now this guy, Lewis Shepard, who was a criminal attorney, he was part of the Vaughn's Brigade or cavalry, and they're the ones who actually took the money. So when he was an old man, I found this great painting, not of him, but it could have been him when he was 25. Here he's 75. And he wrote in the Confederate Veterans Magazine in 1914 that, yeah, he was there. Yeah, they took the money. Yeah, a couple guys became wealthy ranchers in Texas. A couple became wealthy businessmen in California, Ohio, etc. He named no names, but it's clear that they got away with a lot of cash, a lot of gold. Okay, let's see here. This particular case, yeah, okay. People did recover about $110,000, $111,000 of money that people dropped or left behind. And it went into federal custody. Then this case became litigated through the War Claims Court, U.S. House of Representatives, for 28 years. Almost half the people that were part of the original litigants were dead. And in the very end, what did they get for all this effort? $17,000 was awarded to the claimant, but all the banks had failed by that time. And $78,000 remained in custody of the U.S. Treasury in accordance with the confiscation laws. So that ended the longest battle of the Civil War, 1893. And little McCauley Clark, we'll come back to him. There's a gold sovereign on the lower right-hand side. He kept very careful records, and you can see here that out of flight into oblivion, he parsed out to Captain Watson, Captain Van Burenson, Fred Emery, Dixon, Winder, Tillman. By the way, the Tillman family of the Eastern Shore is the same Tillman that's mentioned here. They all got 400 gold sovereigns, and they gave a little bit for traveling expenses. 1 month's pay to Captain Clark. They gave some money to Davis's cook and guard, to 5 Negro servants, $20 each, and miscellaneous $18,930 in gold, and the rest of it went to Rena Davis and her children. So there's where some more money went from the Confederate Treasury. Last but not least, when he was returning, Micaiah Clark was returning to Georgia from Florida, he wrote in his journal, "The Confederate soldiers with jingling silver dollars in their saddlebags on every road in Georgia told the tale of the disbursement of the CSA treasury." So he believes that the money was equitably distributed, and if you heard someone going down the road and you hear a couple coins clanging away, it's because of the work that he and his associates did to make sure the money was dispersed to the soldiers, mostly Joe Johnston's men. Okay, now, this is what we want to take over, Beck? Yeah, if you excuse us for a second, I've got to take off the microphone.
But anyway, there's a lot of money being accounted for, a lot more than they said was on the train, that's for sure. Sure. All yours.
Feel like I'm getting fitted for prom. I've learned a lot by following the treasure train. I've learned a lot about certain things that were happening not in the East, not specifically in this area where there are battlegrounds. And I'm from Wisconsin originally, so we didn't have battlegrounds there at all. Civil War was kind of like something you studied a little bit, and you were told to remember the generals, and you only got a few of them, and but you passed the test and you were on your way. But what I learned was that there was a General Wilson who was deployed by Ulysses S. Grant. So while Grant is going east to be able to capture Petersburg and Richmond, we have Wilson, who is being at the same time coming down from Tennessee and seizing places in Alabama. And I first was thinking, what does this mean? But then I realized that General Ulysses S. Grant is saying, you got to create that net so that anybody who's trying to flee the Confederacy, after I've made Lee surrender and taken Richmond, those are the people that I want to also get, and he expected that that would be the Confederate government. So he gets General Wilson going, and has Wilson starting on that same day that General Grant is attacking Richmond. Wilson is heading south and east. By April 2nd, he's taken Selma, Alabama. He goes east further to Montgomery. Big fight in Columbus, Georgia, but then on to Macon. And by the time April 20th comes around, General Wilson and his troops have secured Macon, which is a big city, and as Rick had mentioned, this is one of the places that the treasure train was going to head. So he successfully stopped that pathway. The orders were to Wilson to watch all of southern Georgia, which is a big task. There was really not good communications, and I know that people were saying there were scouts, etc., but as I'm reading this, Wilson and his troop did not even know certain surrenders had been taking place. They're kind of following the orders of Grant and getting continuous orders, but they had not specifically known of the death of Abraham Lincoln. It was very shocking to them that even by May 5th, that all these things had happened. But they are now perfectly positioned. Wilson's cavalry is perfectly positioned to do what they were asked to do, which is going to be to stop the Confederacy from traveling south, from getting down to the Gulf of Mexico or heading over to Texas. The scouts, and here's my point of Wisconsin, one of the first Wisconsin cavalry was involved. And I actually found that there was a gentleman in that cavalry from my home city. If somebody would have told me that when I was taking a history class back in Waukesha, Wisconsin, I might have even paid more attention. But first, Ohio, that cavalry actually infiltrated some of Jefferson Davis's guards. And so they were able to start telling Jefferson Davis by running scouts that indeed it is Jefferson Davis in one of these trains that's coming down south, and you got to keep your eyes open. 4th Michigan is also now in Macon, and so Wisconsin and Michigan are fighting it out, sort of like a Big Ten thing back then. By May 5th, when Davis is in Sandersville, and as Rick said, they're burning all the ballast. They're just getting rid of paper. They can't carry it further south. The Union Scouts are saying that really there is not this huge protective detail. They had originally thought this is going to be a real problem to try to capture Jeff Davis because he was bringing this huge entourage of protective people. But as Rick said, by the time the Confederacy was collapsing, by the time that Joe Johnston had surrendered, and of course Lee had surrendered, many of the Confederates are saying, I'm out of here, just, let me go home. I want to go home. So there was only a small group of loyalists that are following along with Jeff Davis. Then they learn about there is a $100,000 reward. Now, this is the guys from Wisconsin and Michigan did not know about this at the time, but they are down right at the point of being able to capture Jeff Davis. But some of the other troops did, and certainly some of the other people knew about it. And so this actually upped the ante. It was more than just capturing this old man. So the map on the right, I thought was kind of interesting. Someone had the smarts to be able to do this pink pencil line or pink line down that showed where Jefferson Davis's train was coming. From Sandersonville is where in the green circle where they're burning all the ballast. Then the 2 lines coming from Macon on the left, the green one and the blue one, are the Michigan and the Wisconsin cavalry lines. And so they finally get down to these areas where the rivers are. The rivers are being picketed to make sure that somebody isn't missing the fact that the whatever's left of the Jefferson Davis entourage isn't being missed. And they almost did miss them. There were a couple of correspondents that said they were, the 1st Wisconsin was actually going to go on to Savannah because someone had said the Davis entourage was going to Savannah, and they had a couple colored people that approached them and said, no, I think that Jefferson Davis just crossed this river yesterday, and you go this way. And they said, we believe him. And so they did head the right direction. They went down to Irwinville and were able to successfully capture Jeff Davis and his entourage, which was by that time not very much. Davis was escorted to Macon, and now is when the cavalrymen realized that there is a reward there. And now there's some infighting, like who was really there, who was successful in capturing Jeff Davis. There had actually been a skirmish between the Michigan and the Wisconsin cavalry because they didn't know who was on the other side of a glade. And there was actually a couple Michigan cavalrymen who were shot and killed while they were by the Wisconsin people while they were trying to capture Jeff Davis. But indeed, there was an award given to the soldiers as listed there, the leaders of the various cavalry. And the balance was to be shared among those who were there. And that got into years of court fights. Who was really there? Do we reward the guys that were still the pickets on the out there on the river, or did you have to have the 10 guys who were physically capturing Jeff Davis? Well, it did wind up that Michigan and Wisconsin cavalry did split the reward. Anything that was left over after the big shots got their $3,000 each. But I can't find that reward was ever paid to these people. So it's still curious to me as to where did the money go. One of the soldiers from the 4th Michigan actually created out of what was probably a confiscated Mexican real. Well, he took that shield and made it, captured Jeff Davis, 1865. And that is quite a collector's item. I do not know where that is, but it makes sense that the Davis party would have had some of the Mexican reals on their person. The other coin that Jeff Davis had on his person is one that is today worth over $1 million. It's one of only 4 coins that were known to exist, that were minted at the New Orleans Mint after the Confederates took over the New Orleans Mint in 1861. And Jefferson Davis had one. These are only 4 coins that were actually minted with the phrase Confederate States of America, $50. And Davis had one, and there were 3 others that were given to higher-ups at the Mint in 1861. They are now in the custody of the American Numismatic Society, and again, there is great value to these 4 existing coins. But is there more money? People really don't know. I keep hearing stories about maybe we could go to some of these rivers or sunken cities and get permits to do scuba diving and things like that. That hasn't happened. I think there's still money down there. I think it's still, I'm not sure where, but I think that there's money that was lost along the way. I also think that there were probably people that did take a coin here and there. There wasn't exactly sophisticated accounting. As Rick was saying, all these boxes were labeled for the stuff that belonged to certain people. There could have been gold coins in those boxes. Who knows? Has anybody ever heard of Bubba Burger? It's a frozen burger. Okay, Bubba Burgers was headquartered down in Elberton, Georgia. And the story there goes that when Bubba Burgers was expanding their production plant, something happened when they were doing the big excavation. And all of a sudden, Bubba Burgers has all the money that they need to be able to triple the size of their plant and move it down to Florida. It has been suggested that maybe they actually found a little stash of some of these gold coins or something that had been left over. The treasure train went right near Elberton. It would not have been a shock that there had been a little leftover coinage for the Bubba Burgers. The gold, many golds would have been spent by the bushwhackers. Gold had to be turned into the United States government in the 1920s, 30. So it may have been, what may have been on the train may not exist any longer, but we don't really know. Now I'd like to close with a couple really fast items that are sort of legacies of the Civil War that people often don't put together. It's not directly related to the treasure train. But my first point is, did the cavalrymen actually get their money? And I don't know how they did. I'd like to know that there was somebody running around with saddlebags full of gold coins and handing them off to the soldiers, but I do not know that. One of the last things that President Lincoln did before he was assassinated was sign a bill creating the National Asylums for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers. And this became the framework for the Veterans Administration. Previously, there had not been any sort of a framework for being able to care for people who had been veterans in any sophisticated manner. The third thing that happened after the Civil War, because of the Civil War, was an organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. And that was a Union veterans organization, very strong, and they were extremely politically connected and influential. And many of the people who became presidents later had been members of the GAR. And also then their auxiliary was the Women's Relief Corps. And these people actually did a tremendous amount of work to lobby for pensions. There had not previously been in the code for the United States anything that says, here's how we're going to pay all these people who are our soldiers. Here's how we were going to take care of their families if the soldier died in action. Dog tags. There was not such a thing as a dog tag before the Civil War, one issued by the United States government. Missing soldiers advocacy. Our own Clara Barton was one of the leaders in saying, we've got to account for these people. Even if we can't account for all the money on the train, we got to account for the people. And so she made this one of her personal causes, and one that I certainly admire. And last but not least was Memorial Day. And it was 1866, actually created by a woman down south in Columbus, Georgia, who said, we are not honoring our soldiers. Now, she's talking about the Confederate soldiers, but nonetheless, her point was there must be some way of honoring those who have served. And she was able to get a message into hundreds of newspapers that said, go out, make it a Memorial Day kind of effort and put flowers on the graves of your loved ones. And that really caught on in the South, and finally in the North, Mary Logan, the wife of General John Logan, who was then the head of the Grand Army of the Republic, said, you know, John, we should be doing this too. Then General GAR, General Order 11, was written in 1868, shortly before Mr. Logan presided at the Arlington National Cemetery to create a memorial opportunity. He made this order saying we must be decorating the graves of those who have lost their lives, especially those who lost their lives a long way from home. And that is a legacy of the Civil War. It's now a national holiday, May 27th, coming up soon. And the Women's Relief Corps is still in existence, and Women's Relief Corps, I am a national member of that corps. And one of their major goals is to lay wreaths at cemeteries in the South for Union soldiers who perished when they were fighting for the Union. There's a lot that they do. There's a lot of things that other people do about the Civil War and because of the Civil War. And Rick and I have done a lot of work on the money of the Civil War, but we also know that there's a lot of stories and a lot of humanities of the Civil War that also have not necessarily been brought forward. So I will adjourn this and to questions if someone has any questions of me or of Rick. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious where the GAR Museum is.
The GAR Museum had been in Springfield, Illinois, and it was recently moved to Murfreesboro, Illinois. It's being reconstructed in conjunction with the General John Logan Museum. And so those two things are going to be hand in hand, and the Logan Museum is going to be building a wing for the Women's Relief Corps displays. So that should be up and running fairly soon, optimistically. Any other questions? Well, we're very pleased to have had you all here tonight. I'm delighted that you came, and if there are questions that come up afterwards, please feel free to contact Rick or I. We have our business cards. We obviously have a neat little display in the back of posters of other things that we've done, and we invite your questions and invite your participation. Thank you, Jenny. Oh, Jenny, I see someone with their hand raised.
I just did have a question. The two books that were on one of the first slides,
Yes.
books,
Yes.
are those available?
They're not available now. We are working on republishing them as kind of a one book as opposed to two books, and doing a little fact checking along the way. And so we're in the process of doing it. We hope to have something ready. I'd love to say by autumn. But we know it's a good story, and we're actually, again, I think on one of the flyers, we're suggesting that we can maybe break this story down into smaller bits so that we can tell it as a series of tales and maybe make a documentary movie out of it. I think there's enough stressor here to be able to see soldiers and money guys and money moving around in trunks and barrels, and I think it could be kind of an interesting movie. So a documentary would be one of the things we're looking for. But thank you for asking. And if we get it published, we would like to have it in the library.
Yes, we would like to have it. Yes.
Anything else? Well, I wish you all safe journey.